This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 309 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It's a very, very special episode. It's the recording of our South by Southwest panel on why we need travel more than travel needs us. First, I'd like to pay my respects to the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, where I'm recording at least this intro for the podcast. I have to say, one of the biggest thrills of my professional life was hearing that my pitch was accepted for South by Southwest Sydney, which was the first time that South by Southwest was held outside of Austin, Texas. But I did soon learn that here in Australia, or at least amongst my acquaintances, it's about 50-50 as to whether people had ever heard of South by Southwest. But those who did, they understood that it was a big deal. It's a huge kind of festival that has actually been running since 1987. It's kind of insane. I was in primary school then still, just. A good description, I guess, is from Wikipedia, which says it's an annual conglomeration of parallel film, interactive media, and music festivals and conferences. And of course, this is usually taking place in Austin, but for the first time ever, and apparently ongoing, we had South by Southwest Sydney. Now, our panel was part of the travel, leisure and lifestyle track of the conference. I pitched for it way back in early February, suggesting a panel on the topic of why we need travel more than travel needs us, with three guests: travel journalist Catherine Marshall, Intrepid's Global Environmental Impact Manager Susanne Etti, and loyal listener Anuj. Three totally different viewpoints on this question. Now, very sadly, Anuj was too ill to travel to Sydney for South by Southwest, but I am very grateful that Justin Watson was able to take his place at the last minute. So thank you, Justin, and best wishes, Anuj. I won't drone on as our panel discussion is almost an hour long, but just to say that what you're about to hear was recorded live at South by Southwest Sydney 2023. It was an amazing experience to be part of. And a huge thanks to my brilliant panel. You are all superstars.
Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along to our session today. Of course, first, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where we are standing today. And we are here to do a live recording of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second, but first, very quickly, I would like to welcome or introduce you to my guests, and I'll tell you a bit more about them later. So to my right here, I have Susanne Etti, who is the Global Environmental Impact Manager at Intrepid Travel. Over here we have Catherine Marshall, travel writer and journalist, and Justin Watson, who is an IT professional who also has a passion for travel and has been a long-time listener of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. So thank you, all of you, for coming along today, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation. Our topic is why we need travel more than travel needs us. On my usual podcast episodes, I'll speak with three different guests about the topic at hand. Usually I speak to them separately and then I combine it all. So today I have three fabulous guests all at once. I'm going to, first of all, hear a story from each of them so that we can kind of situate them in the topic. And then we're going to have, second half will be some more open discussion about some of the key topics arising from this. So that's kind of our roadmap for today. And I'm going to start first because I usually do on the podcast and tell a bit of a story from my own travels or something that's relevant to the topic. So for me, the first important thing to say is that, and I think all of my panel would agree, we're talking about travel from a real position of privilege. We are, some of the few people on the planet who do get to travel. And so everything I say should be seen through that lens, and I think all of you would agree with that. We're very, very lucky. Most of us have travelled from other states to come here today, and maybe some of you have as well, and that's a pretty lucky thing that we're able to do. So my story is that I was gifted the travel bug at a very young age by my parents, who thought that it was important to see the world, but they weren't wealthy or, frequent travellers or anything, but they used their long service leave and savings to take my sister and I on 2 really formative trips. We spent 6 months camper vanning around Europe, very budget level. I was 9 years old, and a similar trip around Australia. So that was the extent of my travel in those early years, but it really gave me that passion to see other places, and I'm sure many of you here today have exactly that feel that you want to go and you want to see other places and learn from them. The funny thing was, as much as I wanted to get out and about, apparently my mental health wasn't going to be ready for that. So in my late teens, while I was at university, I suddenly really developed bad panic attacks, bad anxiety, and for the best part of a year, I actually didn't really leave my house. For some months, I barely left my bedroom. So that was really the opposite to this travel bug that was, in my head. And so that was a very unusual time for me, and I started to wonder if I would ever get out and see the world again. It seemed quite an overwhelming thing. So I was living in Perth. I grew up in Perth in WA. And over the next few years, slowly, my anxiety, I learnt to deal with it a little bit. It was getting better, but I thought, weirdly, the only way I can fix this is to leave. And it seemed counterintuitive for me to be brave enough to do that. I still don't know how I was, but I happened to see an ad in the newspaper to teach English in Japan. Pretty, stereotypical thing to do for someone in their 20s. My boyfriend and I applied, and off we went. So suddenly I was living in Osaka, and I had plenty of nightmares before I got there, but I got there, I was immersed in a completely new life. All of the triggers from home that used to set off panic or anxiety were gone, and I distinctly remember about 6 months in, I was just catching the train home from the school, a normal day in Japan, and I suddenly realised, wow, this being abroad, this travelling has changed me profoundly to my core. The anxiety is really, really gone. I felt like a completely new person. So from then on, seemed really important to me to travel frequently. Anxiety, of course, never goes away completely. There's ups and downs to that, as some of you I'm sure know, but it really made me feel, okay, I want to keep travelling. I need that. And I know a lot of you will relate to this. I need this burst of newness. I want to meet new people. I want to see new things. It's, really integral to my core. Then, of course, I started the Thoughtful Travel podcast about 7 years ago, and I increasingly spoke to more and more people who alerted me to many of the problems involved in tourism and travel. So since that time, and I guess I'd had plenty of inklings about this before then as well, but especially from all the people I've spoken to, I've really got this tension. Travel perhaps doesn't really need us. The world is in many ways impacted negatively by us travelling, but I really need it. And there are some ways we can travel that perhaps are useful. There's no black or white answer to this, I think, and that's the kind of things we want to explore today, this grey area of how we can still travel because we really want to and because it's perhaps, good for us and, I feel like I need to travel. So how can we do this but also balance that with not destroying the planet or, disrupting people's lives, etc., etc. So this kind of difficulty in the balancing act of travel is what we're going to cover some more of today. I'm going to start with Catherine. So this is Catherine Marshall. She's an award-winning journalist and travel writer. She's originally from South Africa but has lived in Sydney for about 2 decades. She studied journalism and politics and started her career in news broadcasting at the South African Broadcasting Corporation before moving to Australia, where she's now segued into a very successful career as a travel writer. You'll regularly read her stories in outlets like Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, Financial Review, The Australian and Qantas magazine. So my question, Catherine, is the point of view of a career travel writer, part of your job is to write articles that intend to promote travel and persuade people to travel. But I know you've also travelled to many, many places, including plenty that don't see a lot of mass tourism. So you have a real interest in other less touristed areas. So with all of that said, I'm really interested in your perspective on this topic. And could you tell us a story from your travels that will help us reflect on what we're talking about today?
Yes, sure. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Amanda. I'm often asked by people, because I'm a travel writer, what is your favourite destination? What is your favourite travel memory? And I have to always return to my very first overseas trip, which was not strictly an overseas trip since I was travelling within Africa. And I was working as a young news journalist. Kenya had just opened its borders to South Africa. They'd been closed for 30 years necessarily during the apartheid era. Nelson Mandela had just been released, and I was part of a press contingent that travelled from Joburg to Nairobi to report on this historic re-establishment of ties. And so while it was a work trip, it wasn't a leisure trip, although we did have some leisure time there. It was really formative for me in terms of satisfying a deep, deep desire to actually break out of those strictures and to see the world. And I think I use this as an example, not only because it remains my most potent travel memory. I had done some travel to, Mozambique and Southwest Africa, as it then was, it became Namibia. So we spent our family holidays camping in those areas or doing camping trips locally at home. We didn't travel very much for obvious reasons. But I think it's important when discussing the topic of travellers and travel, which would be the product, the country, the operator, to distinguish our terms. So, the impetus for what we do. So obviously, operators, countries, they need travel. Of course, they need travel. We're a massive part of their GDP and that type of thing. We're a resource. Why do we need travel? And so when I look back to that early trip, there was nothing selfless about it. I think we like to congratulate ourselves as people who are traveling to somehow better the world. That's not true. We travel because we have an inherent self-interest. I wanted to leave my country and see the world. A world I'd only read about in books or seen on TV. And, of course, travel satisfies that.
A follow-up question there. So you have now travelled, obviously, really extensively to lots of different parts of the world. Do you still need travel as much as you always have? Does travel beget travel? The more you see, the more you want? Or could you feel satisfied ever?
No, I don't think. I see my own personal travel as a form of mapping the world and mapping it mentally, so that when I see a map, I can situate myself in the places on that map. And once again, that is an inherently self-interested perspective.
Yeah, a lot of travel is selfish. Yeah, I do the same.
I could also just add to that. I think that we tend to treat travel very much as a birthright, and it's not. I think, there's nothing noble in being a traveller. We, as you mentioned, are extremely privileged to be in this position, and I often wonder when I'm travelling, especially to less advantaged countries, about the people there who probably have the same impetus and who would probably also jump on a plane if they had that opportunity.
Yeah.
And, there's the question about what is the exchange and the reciprocity between those of us who are going out into the world as consumers of destinations and those who are receiving us but who don't necessarily have those same opportunities.
Yeah, it makes me a little heart sore to think about that. I'll always remember when I was travelling in Egypt, 20 years ago probably, and I was staying in a resort, the only time I've ever stayed in a resort. I didn't want to do it again. But it was near a town called El Khazir, near Hurghada, near the Red Sea. And there was a shuttle bus from the hotel into the little town once a day. I took that bus every day. There was usually nobody else from the hotel going into the little town. It was just me. But I went to the souvenirish shop, and I met a young man named Mohammed, and he could immediately tell me exactly where Perth was on the map when I mentioned where I was from, and he had this massive geographical knowledge. We talked for ages, but of course he had definitely never left Egypt. He'd never been more than about 20 kilometres away from his hometown, and we stayed in contact by email for several years until I lost track of him. But he I always wanted to think, I hope he gets to travel. But the chances are, the statistics would suggest, he will never probably ever leave Egypt, and maybe not that area. And yet I'm sure he had, as you said, Catherine, that burning desire to see the world because he knew a lot about it.
And his passport would not necessarily allow him to visit
Absolutely.
places that he might be inclined to.
Yes.
To want to visit.
Absolutely. That passport privilege that we all have with the passports we hold. It's very easy to go nearly anywhere. And yeah. Okay. We'll leave that there and come back to some of this later. But now I would like to hand it to Susanne. So this is Dr. Susanne Etti. She leads climate action at Intrepid Travel. She's originally from Germany and now based in Melbourne. So Susanne is particularly interesting to me here because she has an academic background in biology and only for the past 5 years has been in the travel space working at Intrepid, focusing on global decarbonisation. So some of her areas of work include climate change, biodiversity, carbon reporting and more, which is, of course, something of great interest and importance to travel lovers if we want to kind of do it well. So, Susanne, from the point of view of a climate scientist, but also someone working in the travel industry, tell us a story that will help understand your perspective on this topic.
Thank you. I grew up in Europe, so I was also very privileged early on that my summer holidays, winter holidays were basically in the European Alps, so hiking and skiing. But then I decided to study biology because I already saw the changes of climate change impacting the glaciers in our region. And biology really opened up the world for me because I actually really got out to live and work in 6 different countries throughout my career to date. So one of the countries was Greece. So as a biologist and doing a master, I had to do a master thesis, and I put my hand up straight away going like, yeah, of course, I do field work because that means I can live 6 months outside Germany and just really kind of immerse myself. What that meant is that I actually was in a region called Evros, which is on the border to Turkey. The coastal township is called Alexandroupoli. So I worked at the time collecting a lot of mosquitoes at the time. And it was really kind of nowadays when we look at the climate crisis, it's really how climate change is actually impacting public health. And so that was very early on a study looking at this aspect. But remember, that was in the mid-90s, and that was at a time where there was no mobile, no GPS. Internet cafes in that region wasn't really available. So it was very much about a lot of letters writing, but also operator-assisted phone calls home, because I would run out of drachmen and the telephone box when I would ring home. So we ended up to do a lot of operator-assisted calls. But it was also about kind of really arriving there, thinking initially, I get around with English, and realized no, it's also, there was no DeepL or Google Translator, so I had my dictionary, the German and Greek dictionary, and then the locals were really helpful. I learned the sentence that I couldn't speak Greek, which then people always thought, you can speak Greek. And then,
it's always a danger if you say that too fluently.
Exactly, too fluent. But I learned quite a bit in my 6 months. But the locals were so helpful, especially in the field side, in the remote areas, finding someone, we know someone who can speak English or German. And what also happened was that connection that even lasts today, all these 20 years after, because while I lived there, I entered a shop to buy some herbal tea. And the lady behind the counter was very curious. What does a German student do in the city, which wasn't a tourist city at all? And then she was like, I have a daughter who's coming soon back to Alexandroupoli. She speaks English. You guys need to meet up. All these years later, I've seen her getting married, seeing her kids grow up. So we have that lifelong relationship. But the other thing is also that empathy connection to the land, which came really through this summer in August, when Greece experienced the worst wildfires in their history. And that was actually exactly in Evros. Most of the Dacia National Park got burned down, and it was one of the most severe fires since 2020, since they actually set up a fire risk system. And that was really, being in that space, I see a lot of, my news circle is a lot around seeing these news, absorbing, seeing where incidents happening. But that one particular touched me because that's exactly where I know people. I've done my field work and that real connection to land.
I think that the connection to people and the connection to place that we get from travelling is so important, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think we've probably all got examples of exactly that, where things become much more meaningful because we know someone there, we know that place, we've been there, and when you see them on the news, it's not just news, it's somewhere we've been, and I think that is a really important part of travel. Susanne, I'm interested to know, so at that stage you were already in the scientific area but loved to travel. So over the years, how did you grapple with this kind of tension between travel being bad for the environment, but you loved it? How have you kind of developed those thoughts?
I think I've been very lucky, fortunate, and coming back to the point of passport, that I have been able to live and work in 6 different countries. Work actually brought me out to Australia, and now I'm being really fortunate to really explore Australia, and I'm looking also at ways how to minimize my travel, at least the airfare, when I'm within Australia. So it might be worthwhile to mention that we both actually came on the train from Melbourne to Sydney. I do get it, it's 12 hours, but I do really encourage you all to take up the challenge.
It was a lovely 12 hours, I have to tell you, went by like that. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
So I would love to have another companion next time I'm traveling.
Yeah, so it's, I think you have a more in-depth knowledge of the damage that we can be doing, but you still have that desire to see the world. So, yeah.
And it's maybe for me then really about staying longer. So when I do Europe, because obviously I need to fly if I want to see my family, but especially post-pandemic, I stayed for 10 weeks. I really made the flight worthwhile. And while being in Europe, I really made sure I got everywhere on the train system.
Yeah. Which, of course, is much easier in Europe. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, fabulous. We'll come back to some of those points as well. So, this is Justin Watson over here, and he is an IT professional living in Canberra, but he is here not as an IT professional, although he's very useful in that capacity too, but as an experienced, thoughtful traveller. He has been listening to the Thoughtful Travel podcast for, since close to the beginning, I believe. And a few years ago, I brought him on board to be my co-host of our Thoughtful Travellers book club. So that's what happens if you're vocal in a Facebook group, you get a job. So, and then you've got another job by coming here. So thank you, Justin. But it's interesting to have you because you are, the rest of us work in some capacity in the travel industry, but you are just a quote-unquote normal person, maybe, but a normal person who loves to travel, and I think you probably always were a thoughtful traveller, but you've, thought a lot more about it over the past few years. So I know you have interest in science and tech as well, so that kind of comes into play, and wildlife, which we'll talk about in some detail later as well. Can you tell us your story that will help us reflect on this topic?
I can, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I guess I'll just go back a little bit. I was one of those kids who looked at red atlases in high school, and so, and this is kind of lead up to why I like to travel and where I travel. Like, so I knew where all the capital cities of all the countries in the world were and things like that. And I kind of left that behind because I went to uni, studied engineering, got into IT. I was very career focused. So it wasn't until I was 26 that I actually travelled overseas. So quite late in life. And without giving my age away, it's a little bit over 20 years ago. And so since then, I tend to try to travel to places that you might not first pick as your first destination. So, and a lot of people would say, I went to Central America very early on as a place, and not many people in Australia would go to Central America or even South America or things like that. So, and there's still a lot of places, like I've never been to Bali, and I don't have a problem with that, but there's places like Japan I haven't been to yet either. So, and it's not for any reason, I just find another place that I want to go to. Today I'm just going to talk about, because I just literally got back from Namibia. Not everyone's first choice either. Like a lot of people, if they want to go on safari, it's typically somewhere like Kruger in South Africa, or even Kenya and Tanzania gets a lot of the safari type traffic. But Namibia came across as being very easy to do. You can drive around the country yourself. It's extremely clean and very safe country in Africa, so it really probably should get more tourism than it actually gets. And there was one place I kind of read a little bit about, and it wasn't on the sort of recommended itineraries for self-drive safaris and things like that. And I managed to put that into the itinerary. It was at a place called Okanjima, which is sort of between the main national park, which is Etosha National Park, which everyone goes to, and the capital city, Windhoek. It's not a national park, it's a privately owned reserve where they've bought farmland up to protect, obviously, a lot of species, and it's the home of a place called the Africat Foundation. Basically what Africat were doing, and by going to the lodge and staying there and going on their game drives, you're supporting that kind of the organisation. So Namibia's a country where you've either got large swathes of desert with massive sand dunes, which anyone's seen photos of Namibia, you'll see massive beautiful sand dunes with some dead trees, and that's another place that's well worth seeing. But even just throughout the country, apparently geologists love going there. The geology is just fascinating for geologists. So, and to my untrained eye, it definitely varied a lot. The other side of Namibia is the farms, and the land that they can use to grow crops on or have cattle or goats and all that kind of stuff. And the thing you notice is that there's high fences along the roads. And this is something that the Africat Foundation explained when you're there, was that they're not there to keep animals in, they're there to keep the animals out, like the larger animals like the elephants, the rhinos and even the cats, because the farmers obviously want to make a living. And the crops are not so bad, but anyone with livestock, it's a field day for a leopard that gets in there. And, so...
A buffet.
A buffet, yeah. And so you've got this trade-off between they don't want anyone to shoot the leopards, and it's illegal to shoot the leopards, but it happens. And the reason it happens is because it's such a big country. No one... these leopards can wander onto a farmer's land, and people know about it, and then the people will pay to come and shoot these leopards as well. So it's an awful thing. So Africats basically are trying to come up with solutions here. So within their reserve, the leopard population is growing. One of the things they do is they catch and tag and radio collar the leopards, so they know where they are, so they know if they get out, they can hopefully go get them and get them back in. And leopards are very territorial. They don't get along well with other leopards, so they want to have their own little territory. And it's funny because I did get on. They offer what they call their leopard tracking drives. So you go out with the guide, and they can track the radio collars and try and find some of the leopards. And we actually caught two leopards that were going on a leopard date together, so a male and a female. So, and when they realised we caught them, they ran off into the bushes. So,
you disturbed their date.
Yes, but then we did find another leopard, a younger leopard that had just was eating oryx that it had caught, and we managed to observe that for quite a while. So, and obviously the key thing with these places is the interaction has to be kind of, you want to keep the distance. You just want to observe the animals,
not interrupt their habits.
That's right. And they also have diversified a little bit into other animals. Like they've got pangolins, which are also incredibly hard to see. I don't know if you know what a pangolin looks like, but they've got scales. They're a mammal that has scales, so it's worth a Google later. But turns out they're very hard to even see, even though you know you've got them in your park. So. But the other thing I liked about what Africat were doing there, so they would, it was very small scale, but they also had their education things. So while wealthier foreigners could come and stay there and see leopards and have a really great time, they were also running school programs. So they were getting the kids in, and that was all sort of gratis for Namibian school children, to get them in. And so they had a little education centre set up as well as a vet clinic and all the stuff you need. So, like I said, I've just come back from there, and it was like just the most amazing place and experience. I'd never seen leopards before, and that's not without trying. And I came back from Namibia, I think I've seen 4 in Namibia now, so I'm very happy, along with lions and cheetahs.
And 2 of them on a day.
2 of them on a day, yeah.
That's very exciting.
This is awesome. You mentioned there, Justin, that it was small scale, but I have a strong belief that we have a lot of small scale things. That's often a lot more powerful than having large scale things that get out of hand. So,
and I think even within Namibia, they seem to be doing a pretty good job with poachers. So the leopards, it's not so much about the poaching there; it's more about protecting their incomes.
Yeah.
But rhinos, they've got a lot of black rhinos, which are quite rare, and they've managed to keep them protected to the point now. It might be just that the poaching isn't as strong there, but it's also maybe because the Namibian economy is a bit better off. Like the people in Namibia have a little bit better standard of living, so there's less people looking for those illegal opportunities. I guess it's a multifaceted thing, but I did talk to guides and it's like, the rhinos, you don't dehorn the rhinos here, because in South Africa and other countries they'll take the horns off to stop them from being poached. So they weren't having to do that. So the big national park seemed to be doing a good job at protecting what animals they had there. And I did see a leopard there as well. So they were leopards and lions, cheetahs, they're all around, and they all seem to be doing well. So
the whole wildlife conservation angle of where travel fits in, I think, is a really interesting point. So I'm glad you brought this up, Justin, because I'd like to tackle it a bit further, because it's one of those things. I think during COVID we saw lots of evidence that conservation projects suffered when tourists were not there. So it's one of those, if it's a good conservation project, we can see, okay, we actually need tourists there to support the economy of this area, because if we don't have them, the poachers will take over, or we can't afford to feed the animals in a sanctuary, and lots of issues like that. So, but before I throw to, I know both of you have some more to say on this, but I just want to say, as in all of these areas, it's not black and white. And over the years, of course, I've learned a lot more about like wildlife or animal tourism can be really bad. So you can still ride elephants in some places in the world, but you should not. It's so clearly shown that it's basically an absolute torture for them to reach this stage where they can be used in human interactions. But then we have sanctuaries. So, for example, in Thailand, there's some sanctuaries that are doing a great job of looking after elephants, and there's some that have sanctuary in the name, but you can go along and you can do all of these kinds of person-to-elephant interactions that are definitely not okay. So it's a really hard thing to work out sometimes, what is a good and what is a bad thing to do. Even when you have good intentions, it's, there's a lot of education involved. So, Catherine and Susanna, Susanna, tell us a bit more, because I know you have some opinions on this whole.
Definitely. So what we have seen is that sort of that nature-based tourism has become a really popular form of travel, and definitely on the back of the pandemic. So there's a growing keenness by customers that really want to be outdoors. They want to experience nature, and see the natural wonders, which includes obviously also creatures. So that at the same time then presents a great opportunity for us in the industry to educate actually travelers in the importance of responsible tourism. Because in a way, tourism has two main interaction with animals. One is what Amanda already referred to, is the more exploitative, using animals really for entertainment, and the example is really the elephant riding. But then on the other hand is what we heard already from Justin, is around much more the conservation aspect, the protection where wildlife can really stay in its natural habitat and its surrounding, and that's where we can experience it. So what is for us in Intrepid Travel is an opportunity to actually find then the right partner that you are supporting. So Intrepid Travel has a non-for-profit arm, and that's where we are kind of engaging with local partners. And an example that I brought along was actually from Kenya, where, just to give you some stats, so 12% of land is protected for conservation in Kenya. 9,885 African rhinos have been lost to poaching in the past decade. 100 African elephants are killed each day by poachers. So let these numbers sink in. And so where we come in with the Intrepid Foundation is that we support the East African Wildlife Society. So they are creating or wanting to create an East Africa where people can really enjoy the full diversity, beauty, but also that richness of nature. So the fundraiser or the donations really go towards the Conservancy Ranger program, and that's all around training and providing equipment for rangers.
Yeah, so this is one of those cases where perhaps that helps us find local operators that are doing something right. It's a kind of a filter. So yeah. Catherine, I know you've had a lot of experience travelling in these kind of areas with wildlife. So what have you got to add there?
And I think, it's interesting because, with wildlife experiences, I think travellers can often use wildlife as a prop. And in this age of social media, this tends to happen quite often. And I think it's an important element of this discussion as to whether we need travel more than travel needs us, because why are we travelling? Is it to use a destination and its wildlife as a backdrop to our own narratives that we then feed to our friends, family, followers, etc.? Or is it to enrich ourselves and then to somehow leave a positive impact in the place that we're staying, which hopefully that should ultimately be part of the exchange, I believe. I tend to be more negative about this. I think as travellers we are quite problematic, and I don't think we take these things seriously enough, which sounds pretty rich coming from me because I travel a lot. I'm a travel writer. I'm encouraging people to travel, but I'm a little bit uneasy about that, to be quite honest. And so I think I would encourage people to think more deeply about those exchanges, why they're travelling. And I know this isn't answering your question. I will get there.
I trust you.
But also, there are important considerations. So with wildlife conservation, for example, we tend to think automatically about, hero species like rhino, elephants, pangolins, which are actually, I believe, the world's most trafficked animal. Yet, if we don't care for the communities that surround these wild areas, the wildlife itself will not be preserved. So when you're travelling, it's really important as well to consider community engagement and how these projects actually feed into the communities. And there are a lot of organisations and foundations doing work in this area. There's been phenomenal work done in Africa, right across Africa, by an organisation called African Parks, which manages. I think they've reached well over 10, maybe around 19 national parks across southern, western, north, and central Africa. And they managed areas that have been degraded and have been under-resourced and are suffering, essentially, in partnership with governments and local conservation organisations. And they then rehabilitate these wildlife spaces, which then, of course, means preservation, bigger numbers of, reintroduction of species, that type of thing. And an important element of that is tourism, because tourism brings in, as we were saying earlier, the money. I think something like 10% of people the world over are employed in tourism. The difficult thing with this is that I don't have statistics to back this up, but I don't believe people are actually visiting the places that need tourism most. And so when you think about the tension between this, do we need travel more than travel needs us? Travel needs us, but are we traveling in the places where they need us most? And I was actually in a Zoom session a couple of months ago with some industry leaders from Africa and travel agents, travel professionals here in Australia. And this topic came up, and that was, not that many people want to travel to Africa, which is why I'm very impressed that you've been before this as well, I know, Justin, and to a place like Namibia where, you can have an incredible safari, incredible sightings, dating leopards. But people do just tend to think, oh, the place you've got to go is the Serengeti and the Masai Mara during the migration. And I have not been there during the migration, but I've heard that it's bedlam. It's like, Pitt Street on a weekday afternoon at 4 p.m. when everyone knocks off work. So really, as travellers, we should also be thinking about how do we support projects that need it most, and how do we actually redistribute the spoils of tourism.
So you have, I think, almost accidentally segued me into a very important topic here. So what you said about, yes, travel does need us, but it needs us maybe not in the way we're doing it, brings me to one of those other areas that has been in the news a lot lately of overtourism. So this is, we're all going to the same places, and yes, a lot of people want to go to Paris and see the Eiffel Tower or go and take their selfie with the Mona Lisa. Not quite sure I don't want to do that, but okay, if you want to. I think my constant message about over-tourism, which I'm going to ask you all about in a second, is it's okay to want to go to Paris or Angkor Wat or whatever, but think about it. Is that what you really want to do, or is there some other force that has made you think that this is what you want to do? I was telling Catherine this morning, I opened up my Facebook to see the Japan travel planning group I'm in, and someone had just arrived in Kyoto, and they were saying, I've just got to Kyoto from Tokyo, and I expected Tokyo to be busy, but Kyoto is, it's overrun with tourists. I mean, they were also a tourist. And I was like, well, it's surprising to me that they didn't realise that. But then in the comments, people were asking them all, and their complaint was, or their question was, where can I go today so it's not so crowded? I've got my kids and, they don't like the crowds. And people asked them, well, where were you going to go today? And they were like, oh, well, the bamboo forest and the Golden Temple. And someone answered, well, those are the two most crowded places you could possibly find in Kyoto. Here are some options. But this kind of tension that people want to go to the places that they've heard about and they've seen all the photos of, we have to get past that somehow. Catherine and I were in Japan just a couple of weeks ago, but not in Kyoto. And we were up in the Tohoku region, inland and along the coasts near Sendai, and we barely saw another foreigner. We certainly did not see any crowds, except maybe that little crowd of school kids on the train with us one day, and it was absolutely fabulous. And I don't feel that we missed out by not being in a massive queue to see a temple in Kyoto. So this whole over-tourism part is something we need to think about
and
some
you've
more.
still got ramen.
And we still got ramen,
Oh, yes.
mochi. We got everything we needed. So I would like to hear some more about what we think about over-tourism. Maybe, Susanna, I know you have a European example to start with.
Yeah, maybe. And I bring it maybe back to nature, sort of looking at the kind of more conservation-focused tours that really aims to be that antidote to those big crowds, especially around Europe. Think Barcelona, Vienna or other places. But that's really around the partnership that Intrepid Travel has here with the Meet Network is in Southern Europe. And the Meet Network is basically an association of protected areas. It's all in the Mediterranean that creates sustainable tourism products with the goal of benefiting conservation and communities at the same time. So they were founded really to create that new ecotourism model that provides a membership network for protected areas that commit to embracing that new way of travel to experience the area, but also developing those areas that need, as you said, Catherine, more the tourism than others. So, and that can really then be kind of getting to know the lesser known treasures of Croatia's Dalmatian coast or corners of Crete, for example. And you get the meal with the local family. You may go out with the fisher and you really be part of that area and learn about the conservation efforts.
I know probably both of you will have something to say on the lesser known or the diversification of destinations.
Well, yes. I mean, so during our Japan trip, so Amanda and I did a walk. We followed Basho's trail, the haiku poet Basho's trail, which I think you will hear about on a later podcast, and you could read about in the Sydney Morning Herald's traveller section in a couple of weeks' time. But we then did our own side trip and were very keen to see some of the coastline, the Fukushima coastline and Iwate coastline actually, that had been devastated by the tsunami and earthquake of 2011. And it seems like such a long time ago, but really it's a blip in terms of how this region has managed to redevelop. And, it is still very under-touristed. We stayed in a little town called Namaita Kaigan, and we were really the only tourists. I mean, it's not a tourist area, but there were places to stay. There were interesting things to do there. And just a train ride further down the coast is an incredible museum that has been built to memorialise this event, to explain it, to discuss ways of mitigating further loss of life. And so that was an incredible place to visit. But the problem is, how do you then encourage listeners or readers to visit a place like that, or to find other such places that are crying out for tourists to visit? From my own perspective as a travel writer, I'm not sure if people know how it works, but really we write, we are sent on trips, we are hosted, so we in no way represent the typical reader who has thought long and hard about where they're going to be spending their money. And we write about places that have the resources to host us. Therefore, places that don't have, or operators that don't have that resources, lose out on publicity. And I struggle with this as well. So I'm not sure that there's a resolution to that, because there are some publications in the US, like the New York Times and a few other publications, that won't publish hosted content. We call it hosted content, which is different from sponsored content. And that's also all very well, but then you would end up with a range of very privileged voices, because the people writing those stories would have to have the resources to take themselves to these places.
There's a lot of economics involved in this whole piece, isn't it?
Yes.
So the way that we hear about other destinations is often through various kinds of media, but what's put on that media is connected to advertising spend or the destination marketing organisations that have the biggest clout or the biggest budget, etc., etc. So it's harder to get those off the radar places into some kind of radar.
Yeah, they just are never written about. And I remember a few years ago I travelled to the Republic of Congo, not to be confused with the Democratic Republic of Congo, they're neighbouring countries, and visited a place called Odzala Kakua National Park, where there are western lowland gorillas, and incidentally, there's incredible conservation work going on there. They are trying to develop a tourism industry, but of course, few people will travel there. And I wrote several stories for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age for their traveller section. And I remember the digital editor saying to me after he'd published the first one, "That's the first story on this country that we have on our website."
Wow.
And I'm sure there would be many other countries. You mentioned Central America, for example. There would be so many places. And then there are other cities, countries, regions that are absolutely overrepresented.
Definitely. Leading on from that, so Justin, you are this quote-unquote normal traveller, but you have often gone to these lesser-known destinations. So what's drawn you to do that? Why are you like that? What can we learn from you?
It's a good question. I think I'm wondering if people go to places because they've seen other people go to a place, or whether there's a sense of familiarity, so they like going somewhere they feel comfortable and familiar with. When I look for places and things, like I read up on all sorts of stuff. I'll follow little links and trails on the internet, and I'll end up finding out about some place. And that's how I found out about this Okonjima in Namibia, for example. But that started with already going to Namibia. Sometimes I'm just reading about things and stuff like that. And a recent example was I was also in Cape Town beforehand, and if you look up the top 10 things to do in Cape Town, I probably did very few of them. I mean, I did go down to the Cape and I saw a penguin colony, but I didn't go up to the top of Table Mountain. And partly that was weather, and partly because the queues were massive, and I just thought I'm not interested in being shepherded into a gondola to go to the top of Table Mountain. But
you could have climbed it.
I could have climbed it. But I came back from Cape Town, and I've had an amazing experience, and I didn't have to do any of these things. You know, I did things like walking tours, or if you're ever in a city and you see the free walking tours, that's my number one tip. So if you're really unsure about a place and you turn up, see if you can find the free walking tours, because they're often led by people passionate about where they live. Students, sometimes they're not. Like in Cape Town, there was one guy one was a student and I forget the other one. But anyway, they were both very passionate about the areas they did their walking tours on. And I found that all around the world, but I think also the more you travel, you gain a level of experience. So you then, you can turn up into a country that you haven't been to. Like the first time I went through Johannesburg, I was very young. I hadn't travelled that much. I was actually quite scared at that airport. And this time I'm just 15 years after the first time, I whizzed through the airport, no problems whatsoever. Didn't worry about the people who looked a bit dodgy trying to get me into a taxi or anything like that. So you gain that experience and confidence to then, when you're looking at Europe, you go, well, I'm going to get a good experience no matter which country you pick in Europe. You're going to get interesting and good food no matter where you pick in Europe. So why go to the ones that you know everyone goes to? And then next thing you know, like I mentioned, like Slovenia, and I know I've spoken to you before about Georgia, which is not quite Europe, but it's very European. And it's actually closer to Australia because it's only a couple of hours from Dubai, so it's a much shorter trip. And I'm like going, why aren't people going to this Georgia?
Yeah.
It's it's an amazing country. The food is amazing, even if it's a bit heavy on carbs. So if you're not into your carbs, don't go there.
You just need to do a few hikes at the same time, and that counters it.
There's a lot of churches up the top of hills, so if that's your thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same as why don't people go to South America? I mean, I know people do go to South America, but it's quite easily accessible from Australia. And I have heard, I don't have statistics on it, but I've heard that it's not a very, terribly popular destination. And of course, South America is not a country, much like Africa is not a country. There are many places there to be explored. There's the Amazon. When we talk about conservation, and I've actually volunteered on a scientific project, but specifically for tourists in the Peruvian Amazon, and it was a form of citizen science. So there are so many places people could be visiting in order to redisperse that tourism largesse.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm wondering if safety. Sometimes I think people may not understand.
Yeah, I think, and
situations.
the level of experience that you have, and
so I think I think there's nothing wrong with going to, like, everyone. If you read up about, say, going to Rio, there's a lot of places there you wouldn't go to, and a lot of South American cities. But you leave the cities in most countries in the world, get out. Same in Africa, a lot of the African capital cities. As soon as you get out of those African capital cities, the safety is generally fine. I think people, I guess you need to try it and take that chance, I guess.
And I think that's part of if we circle back to where I started with, travel empowered me and made me feel confident and brave, and then the more you do it, the more you can be in those other destinations. Now, just to finish up, I want to go back to kind of the opposite of everything we've said, which is that basically we probably all should travel less, okay, unfortunately. But to balance out the whole travel doesn't need us as much as we need it, are there ways that we can travel less? So, for example, my biggest thing I try and do is always try and spend a longer time in one destination. And people often look at me funny, like a few years ago, just before COVID, I went to Denmark for about 3 weeks. And people just kept asking me as I was planning the trip, oh, so you're going to go to Sweden too? Oh, you're going to go here too? And I'm like, no. And Denmark's a really small country, but there's plenty to do there. And yes, I was going to spend all that time there. And
I felt a lot of, I had to resist a lot of, and of course I thought, oh, maybe I should. It's just not far. I could do this, this and this. But I know that I get a lot more out of a place if I spend a longer time there. We had like about 10 days in Copenhagen, rented bicycles from a lovely social enterprise, in fact, that was training bicycle engineers in Mozambique. But we had a lot more, it was a lot more in-depth trip, and I enjoyed it much more than if I had spent that 10 days in Denmark and Sweden and Norway. So that's kind of something that is, again, it's that you have to face this resistance of what is a normal way to travel, but I find it much more worthwhile. So just quickly to finish up, some other ways that we travel less. So for business, Justin?
Yeah, I think you've got to look at your business travel. There's a few things there. Like if you can do it over Skype or something, then do it over Skype.
I mean, Zoom is like everyone, even my parents in their 80s can Zoom now. So.
Yeah. But the other way, and I think you could do it, is if you are going to travel for business, then see if your company will let you do your annual holiday then.
Oh, well, Susanne.
And I think Susanne was going to talk about that.
Yeah.
Or, try and do something positive out of it to make the most out of that opportunity. And, I had a job years ago where I was all around Australia, but I had to go all around Australia because I was installing equipment. So that kind of travel you have to do. But you just got to think, like a lot of people will put an overemphasis on that face-to-face, it's so much easier to do it face-to-face, and it's, are you really gaining that much more out of that then? So it's just, I guess you just got to think about what you're travelling for.
There's ways and there's ways.
Like we've come up here and you caught the train, I caught the train. So, if you can catch trains, I've heard they're getting new trains in New South Wales next year, so that should make it easier.
When are we getting them?
Yes.
The thing is, if you're sort of a business person, and this is what happens in Europe and that, people work on the train. So if they've got Wi-Fi and the table and the desk is suitable, then
exactly.
It's going to be much better than going to the airport, in the lounge and then have to pack up again, get on the plane, open up your laptop again.
Oh, trains are so much easier in and out of the city centre. So that's perfect.
And hopefully one day our trains will get a little faster in Australia.
And certainly in other parts of the world. It's a good thing. Susanne, you have a few ideas?
I think it's about staying longer. That's a really big thing I encourage everyone. Just don't just fly to Bali for 3 days. It doesn't benefit your health. It doesn't benefit the planet, but also not the destination, the people on the ground. So it is about that staying longer. So I love you hearing that you spent actually that month nearly in Denmark. Just enjoy that one place. Be there. Really get grounded, get to know where you get maybe your breakfast, the local shops, etc. Yes. So with travel, it's really, and I do recognize, again, that's around privilege, but do stay longer if you can. Talk to your employer. Is there an opportunity to work a bit remote? Maybe an opportunity to connect it with the business travel, and one meets in the middle with the ticket, but just mostly to really think about it. If I fly, can I spread the emissions of that long-haul flight that most of us we have to take if we want to explore the rest of the world over more days? Fly most direct if you can, like the one stopover, but don't look for the cheap flight that has like 3 stopovers, like do one to Europe. Once you're in Europe, get yourself a ticket and just really explore Europe by train.
And Catherine, of course, as a travel writer, it's usually necessary to travel frequently, but what are your thoughts?
But I've been trying for some time, and I concur with you, to dovetail trips, which is difficult because usually you're dealing with different public relations people. I'm actually off to New Zealand on Saturday, doing 2 different stories for 2 different newspapers, and I was able to, instead of doing 2 trips, to actually dovetail those 2 trips, which makes it longer for me, but, it's better for the environment, it's a better use of time as well. And I would also say, as an immigrant, I've lived here for coming up for 23 years, and my family and I have really explored this country, almost every inch of this country, usually by car, camping on the side of the road, wherever we find a spot. And I think we need to fall back in love with our own localities and our own backyard, essentially.
Yeah. I think that's a really good
point too.
Yeah. And when you're feeling that urge to travel, I mean, of course, it's once again, it's fine. It's easy for me to say because I do travel a lot, and I think, you need to see those places and scratch that itch, as it were. But travel does not have to involve climbing on a plane and flying halfway across the world.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you. I don't think we have a clear, beautiful answer to our discussion of why we need travel more than travel needs us. Well, maybe we know that's true. That maybe that's an answer.
Maybe
but
just think more about it.
Yes. So exactly, Justin. That is the whole point of the Thoughtful Travel podcast, and the thing I've been banging on about for 7.5 years is that, yes, there are things that are not ideal about travel. There are things that are selfish, and we do them purely selfishly, but that's kind of okay. We're allowed to do that too. But above all, if we can just put some more thought into how we travel, where we travel, do a little bit of research, just try and optimize what we're doing so that we can do the parts where travel does need us and do those well. And then the parts where travel doesn't need us because we're causing harm, try and do those things, as better as we can. Then I think, we can all come a long way if we put in a bit more thought. So thank you very much to my fabulous panel. It was such a pleasure to gather you all here together, and hope you all are left with something to think about. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
I'm so proud of all of us. Everyone was a bit nervous as we gathered in the green room before our panel, but spoke so beautifully once we hit the stage. So well done, gang. I'm really glad I could share this day with all three of you. It was such an absolute pleasure. And listeners, thank you very much for listening to this episode 309 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Of course, this episode was recorded live at South by Southwest Sydney 2023. Thank you so much to the South by Southwest team for all their help as well. It's a massive event, so huge organisation involved there. A big shout out, of course, to these fabulous guests, and some links are, you can find out more about Intrepid Travel, of course, where Susanne Etti is working at intrepidtravel.com. Thanks also to Catherine Marshall. You can follow her on Instagram at Zizzy Ballard. And Justin has a blog called justins.world, which includes some fabulous wildlife pics from Namibia, which he mentioned during our panel. And, of course, you can find out more about South by Southwest Sydney at southbysouthwestsydney.com. And, of course, it is SXSW for South by Southwest. That's definitely going to be happening next year, I hear. So I recommend it as something really cool to get along to. Of course, don't forget you can also chat more about all of this on either our Facebook or LinkedIn groups, and the links for those will be in the show notes, along with some pictures of the day. So you can see the show notes at notaballerina.com/309. As always, thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.